A child stood before 12 men who
What
could
happened
send
here?
her back to
They
hell.
took everything.
Who
Then
did?
she did something
sheriff's
no one
men.
expected. She looked her
busier than I
tormentor in the eye
expected.
and screamed the words
your
that
eyes
would
open.
change everything. Don't you call me a liar. My mama died protecting me from men like him. But this story didn't start in a courtroom.
Here, take this.
It started 3 months
you.
earlier
You're
when a
welcome,
desperate cowboy, a mail-order bride no one wanted, and a dying child found each other at exactly the right moment. Before we begin, if you believe in stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more tales of courage that'll restore your faith in humanity. And drop a comment telling us where you are watching from. Are you in Texas, California? Maybe all the way in Europe? We love hearing from our global family. Now let me take you back to Wyoming Territory, summer of 1885. The summer of 1885 came to Wyoming Territory like a promise half kept. The sun burned hot across the valley, turning the grass gold and the sky a blue so pure it hurt to look at. But in the shadow of the mountains where Graham Wade's ranch sat like a fist against the horizon, the air carried the weight of endings. Graham stood on his porch that June morning, 40 years old, and feeling every one of them in his bones. The whiskey bottle on the rail beside him was half empty, though the sun had barely cleared the ridge. In his calloused hand he held a piece of paper that smelled of printer's ink and desperation. The words swam before his eyes, mocking him with their simple promise. Mail-order brides, reliable, discreet, correspondence, welcome. He had written the letter 3 nights ago, drunk on grief and exhaustion, and the kind of loneliness that makes a man do foolish things. The requirements had seemed reasonable at the time. He needed help, not a wife, not really. He needed someone who could handle the work, who wouldn't mind the isolation, who understood that his heart had been buried 3 years ago with Catherine and wasn't coming back. The letter was probably halfway to Boston by now. Graham took another pull from the bottle and tried to remember exactly what he had written. Something about 2 children. Something about hard work. Something honest, he hoped, though. Honesty and whiskey rarely mixed well. Behind him, the screen door creaked. Emmy appeared 10 years old and already carrying herself like someone twice that age. Her mother's eyes looked out from her face, green and sharp, and missing nothing. "Papa," she said. Her voice had that careful quality it always had these days, like she was talking to something fragile. "Toby won't eat again." Graham turned to look at his daughter. Her dress was clean but faded, sewn by hands too young for such work. Her hair was braided tight against her head, the way Catherine used to wear it. Everything about her was older than it should be. "Did you try the eggs?" "He just stares at them. He hasn't said a word since yesterday morning." Graham set down the bottle. Toby was 6 years old and hadn't been right since the day his mother died, bringing him into the world. The boy could speak. The doctors in Boulder had confirmed that much. He simply chose not to most days. And on the days when his silence stretched longest, Graham felt the weight of it like a stone in his chest. "I'll talk to him," Graham said. "You always say that. It doesn't help." The accusation in her voice was small but sharp. Graham had no answer for it. He was good at many things. Ranching, surviving, keeping his children fed and clothed and safe from the wolves that prowled the darkness beyond their fence. But talking the kind that mattered, the kind that Catherine had been good at, that was beyond him. He found Toby in the kitchen, sitting at the table with his eggs going cold in front of him. The boy was small for his age, with dark hair that fell into his eyes and a way of holding himself perfectly still, like a rabbit that knows the hawk is circling. "Son," Graham said, lowering himself into the chair across from his boy, "you need to eat." Toby said nothing. His eyes stayed fixed on the plate. "Your sister worked hard on those eggs. It's disrespectful not to try." Still nothing. Graham felt the familiar frustration rising in his throat, hot and useless. He thought of Catherine, how she would have known what to say, how to reach through the silence, and pull their son back into the world of the living. But Catherine was dust and bones in the ground behind the house, and Graham was just a man who had run out of words 3 years ago. "All right," he said finally. "Sit here as long as you want, but those eggs better be gone by noon or there's no supper tonight." He stood feeling the creak in his knees, the ache in his back that never quite went away anymore. Emmy was watching from the doorway, her face a mask of disappointment that cut deeper than any knife. "I'm doing my best," Graham said, though he wasn't sure who he was talking to. "Your best it isn't enough," Emily said. Then softer, "We need help, Papa." "Real help." Graham thought of the letter rattling its way east on a train carrying his desperation to some stranger who probably wouldn't even respond. Women didn't come to places like this not willingly, not unless they were running from something worse. The next 6 weeks passed like water through a sieve. The ranch work piled up faster than Graham could handle it alone. Fences needed mending, livestock needed tending. The roof over the barn had a hole that was getting bigger with each rain. Emmy did what she could, but she was 10 years old and already doing the work of a grown woman. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. Graham stopped checking the mail after the first 2 weeks. Whatever reply might come, if any came at all, he wasn't ready for it. He had sent that letter in a moment of weakness, and now he had to live with the consequences of his own foolishness. Then on a Thursday afternoon in late July, a wagon rattled up the long drive to his ranch. Graham was fixing the fence by the north pasture when he heard it. The sound of wheels on dirt, the heavy breathing of horses pushed too hard in the summer heat. He straightened one hand, going automatically to the rifle leaning against the fence post. Visitors were rare out here, and the ones who came usually wanted something he couldn't afford to give. The wagon crested the rise, and Graham saw the driver first. A thin man with a face like saddle leather and eyes that looked anywhere but at his passenger. Then Graham saw her. She was large. That was the first thing, unavoidable and immediate. The dress she wore, dark blue and travel-stained, stretched tight across shoulders broader than most men's. Her face was round and red from the heat, framed by brown hair that had mostly escaped whatever pins had tried to hold it. She was sweating through her clothes, and even from a distance, Graham could see the set of her jaw, the way she held herself with a dignity that dared anyone to comment. The wagon stopped in front of the house. Emmy emerged onto the porch, Toby hiding behind her skirts. The driver climbed down, moving with the quick efficiency of a man eager to complete an unpleasant task. "Mr. Wade," he called. Graham walked toward them, his rifle still in his hand, though he kept it pointed at the ground. "That's me. Got a delivery for you, from Boston." The driver jerked his thumb toward the woman who was gathering her skirts to climb down from the wagon. "Says she's expected." The woman managed to descend without falling, though it was a near thing. Her feet hit the ground with a solid thump, and she stood there for a moment, catching her breath, looking at the ranch, the house, the children on the porch. Finally, her eyes found Graham. "You're Mr. Wade." Her voice was deeper than he expected, with the clipped accent of the East Coast. "I am." Graham felt something between his ribs, a tightness that might have been panic. "And you're Mrs. Hartwell, Beatrice Hartwell." She said it with a straightness that suggested she had been practicing. "Though I suppose we can dispense with formalities. You wrote requesting a sturdy woman for ranch work. Well, I'm sturdy." The driver made a sound that might have been a laugh. Beatrice turned to him with a look that could have frozen summer itself. "You're paid," she said. "You can go." "Don't you want me to wait, in case?" The driver's eyes went to Graham, to the ranch, to the obvious poverty of the place. "In case of what?" "In case, mister Wade decides I'm not what he ordered. I'm not a piece of furniture to be returned if the finish doesn't match." Beatrice's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "Thank you for your service. You may leave." The driver shrugged, climbed back onto his wagon, and left without another word. The dust from his wheels hung in the air like a question mark. Graham and Beatrice stood 10 feet apart, studying each other. Up close, she was even larger than he had first thought. Easily 250 pounds, maybe more. But there was something in her eyes, a sharpness, an intelligence that made him reconsider his first assessment. "I didn't expect you," Graham said finally. "I mean, I didn't think anyone would respond. Yet you sent the letter." "I was drunk." "That explains the spelling errors." She bent down, picked up her single battered suitcase with hands that looked like they knew work. "You should know something, Mr. Wade. I came here because I have nowhere else to go. My family's money is gone. My prospects in Boston were limited. People look at me and see only one thing. I expect you're doing the same right now." Graham was doing exactly that and hated himself for it. "I wrote that I needed help with the ranch, with the children. I didn't specify my size." Beatrice's laugh was bitter. "No, you specified sturdy. Well, here I am. Probably more sturdy than you bargained for." She paused, seemed to gather herself. "I'll make you a deal, Mr. Wade. Give me 3 months. If I can't do the work, if I'm not what you need, I'll leave. No questions, no obligations. But until then, I expect to be treated with basic human dignity. Can you manage that? On the porch, Emmy was watching with her arms crossed. Toby had disappeared completely, probably hiding in the house. Graham thought about the work piling up around him, the fence that needed mending, the meals that needed cooking, the children who needed anyone to help shoulder the weight of keeping this family from falling apart completely. I sleep in my room, he heard himself say. You'll have the spare room in the back. This isn't a real marriage. Yes, I understand. You made that clear in your letter. You want a housekeeper and ranch hand who happens to wear a dress. Beatrice shifted the suitcase to her other hand. That's fine. I want a roof over my head and work that matters. We both get what we need. 3 months, Graham said. 3 months, Beatrice agreed. She walked past him toward the house, her steps heavy but steady. When she reached the porch, she looked down at Emmy, who barely came up to her shoulder. You must be Emmeline, Beatrice said. Emmy, nobody calls me Emmeline. Emmy then, I'm Beatrice. Your father and I have an arrangement. I'm here to help with the work. I'm not trying to replace your mother. Emmy's eyes narrowed. Good, because you couldn't. I'm sure that's true. Your mother must have been an extraordinary woman to raise a daughter as capable as you clearly are. Beatrice set down her suitcase. Where's your brother? Hiding. He doesn't like strangers. Smart boy. I don't much like strangers either. Beatrice looked at the door, then back at Emmy. Should I wait out here until he decides to come out, or may I come in? Emmy stepped aside without a word. Beatrice picked up her suitcase and walked into the house that would be her home, at least for the next 3 months, if she lasted that long. Graham watched from the yard, his rifle still in his hand, wondering what in God's name he had just done. The first 3 days were a revelation. Graham had expected resistance, complaints, the kind of delicate helplessness that women of any size sometimes affected when faced with real work. What he got instead was Beatrice Hartwell, rising before dawn, building the fire, and preparing breakfast for 4 people without being asked. The eggs were perfectly cooked. The biscuits were better than anything Catherine had made, and thinking that felt like a betrayal so sharp, it took his breath away. On the second day, he found Beatrice in the north pasture hammering fence posts with a strength that surprised him. She moved slowly, her size making some movements awkward, but she was methodical and thorough. By the time the sun reached its peak, she had mended 20 yards of fence that Graham had been putting off for 2 weeks. You know your way around a hammer, he said, approaching her with a canteen of water. Beatrice took the canteen, drank deeply, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. My father was a carpenter before he lost everything. He taught me that work is work, regardless of who does it. Most women wouldn't. I'm not most women, Mr. Wade. I thought we had established that. She handed back the canteen. The posts near the creek need replacing. The wood is rotted through. I can do it tomorrow if you have the materials. Graham did have the materials. He had been planning to get to it next week or the week after or whenever he could find the time that never seemed to come. I'll help you, he said. Suit yourself, but I don't need supervision. I know what I'm doing. She did. That was the thing that kept catching Graham off guard. She knew how to work, knew how to move through the day with purpose and efficiency. She didn't complain about the heat or the isolation or the primitiveness of the accommodations. She simply did what needed doing, then moved on to the next task. Emmy watched Beatrice with a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect. On the third day, Graham found them in the kitchen together, Emmy teaching Beatrice how to operate the cast iron stove, which had quirks that only someone who had used it for years would know. The left burner runs hot, Emmy was saying. You have to watch it or everything burns. Thank you, I'll remember that. Beatrice was kneading bread dough, her large hands working the mixture with practiced ease. Do you bake often? I do everything. Papa tries, but he's not good at house things. Emmy paused. He's not good at a lot of things, actually. Emmy, Graham said from the doorway. Both of them turned to look at him. Emmy's face showed no remorse. Beatrice's expression was carefully neutral. It's all right, Mr. Wade, Beatrice said. Children should be honest about their observations. She shouldn't be disrespectful. Was I disrespectful, Emmy? Beatrice asked. Emmy considered this. No, I was just telling the truth. Then there's no problem. Beatrice shaped the dough into a loaf, placed it in the pan. Truth is important, even when it's uncomfortable. Graham had no answer to that. He retreated to the barn where the work was simple and didn't require words he didn't have. The breakthrough with Toby came on the fourth day. Graham was mending harness in the barn when he heard the crash from the house followed by Toby's distinctive sound of distress. Not quite crying, not quite screaming, something in between that Graham had learned meant his son was overwhelmed and terrified. He ran for the house, his heart hammering, visions of blood and broken bones filling his mind. What he found instead was Toby standing in the kitchen, his small body rigid with fear, and Beatrice kneeling on the floor among the scattered pieces of a broken bowl. "It's all right," Beatrice was saying, her voice soft and steady. "Accidents happen. Nobody's angry." Toby's eyes were wide and fixed on the broken pottery. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. Graham recognized the signs. His son was about to run to hide in whatever dark corner he could find, and it might be hours before they could coax him out. "Toby," Graham started, but Beatrice held up one hand asking for silence without words. She gathered the pieces of the bowl, her movements slow and deliberate. "When I was your age," she said, still not looking at Toby directly, "I broke my mother's favorite vase. It was porcelain, very expensive, brought all the way from China. I was terrified. I thought my mother would send me away." Toby's eyes flickered to her face, then away. "Do you know what she did?" Beatrice continued. "She knelt down just like this, and she picked up every piece. Then she showed me something wonderful. She showed me that broken things can be fixed. Not always the same as before, but fixed nonetheless. Beautiful in a new way." She held out one of the larger pieces to Toby. "Would you help me collect these? I promise you won't be punished. I promise nobody is angry. We'll clean this up together, and then we'll have lunch, and this will just be a thing that happened. Not a disaster. Just a thing." Toby stared at the piece of pottery in Beatrice's palm. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then so slowly, Graham almost didn't see it happen. Toby reached out and took the broken piece from her hand. "Thank you," Beatrice said. "You're very brave." Together, they picked up the scattered remains of the bowl. Graham watched from the doorway, something tight in his chest beginning to loosen. When the last piece was collected, Beatrice disposed of them in the scrap bin, then washed her hands at the pump. "Now," she said to Toby, "I made soup. It's not very good, I'll be honest. I'm still learning how to use your stove, but it's edible and you must be hungry. Will you try some, Mom?" Toby looked at Graham. His father nodded. Then, for the first time since Beatrice had arrived, Toby moved toward the table without being told. That evening, after the children were in bed, Graham found Beatrice on the porch. She sat on the steps, her large frame somehow making the space seem smaller and more protected. The stars were coming out overhead, brilliant and cold. "Thank you," Graham said, "for today, with Toby. I didn't do anything special." "You did. He doesn't trust people, not since his mother died." Beatrice was quiet for a moment. "He was looking at me when the bowl broke. I think he was curious, came closer than he meant to, and his elbow caught it. He expected me to yell to punish him. Someone taught him that breaking things means pain." "Nobody taught him that," Graham said, defensive. "Then he learned it somewhere. Children don't develop that kind of fear without reason." Beatrice's voice was gentle but firm. "I'm not accusing you, Mr. Wade, but something happened to make that boy believe he has to be invisible to be safe." Graham sat down on the steps beside her, keeping a careful distance. "His mother died the day he was born. Complications. The doctor tried everything, but—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat. "Catherine held him once. Just once, then she was gone. Emmy was 7, old enough to understand what we'd lost. But Toby, he never knew her. He only knows the absence." "And you blame him?" "No." The word came out too fast, too defensive. "I don't blame him. But you can't look at him without seeing what you lost. And he knows it." Beatrice turned to face him, her eyes dark in the starlight. "Children always know." Graham wanted to argue, to defend himself against the accusation, but he had run out of lies to tell himself, and he was too tired for new ones. "I don't know how to fix it," he said finally. "Neither do I, but maybe we can learn together." Beatrice stood, her knees creaking with the effort. "I'm going to bed. Tomorrow I'll start on the roof. The leak over the barn is going to get worse if we don't patch it soon." She went inside, leaving Graham alone with the stars and the weight of his failures. The days developed a rhythm. Beatrice rose before dawn, started the fire-prepared breakfast. Graham and Emmy handled the livestock while Beatrice managed the house and the endless list of repairs that had piled up over 3 years of neglect. Toby moved like a ghost through it all, still not speaking, but no longer running quite so quickly when Beatrice entered a room. On the 10th day, Emmy announced that they needed to go to town for supplies. Graham had been putting it off as he put off most things that required dealing with other people. But the flour was running low and they needed nails and wire and a dozen other things that couldn't be made or improvised. "We'll go Saturday," Graham said, "to the summer fair in Willow Creek. Kill two birds." Emmy's face brightened. "Can we bring Ruth?" Graham blinked, confused. "Who's Ruth?" "Mrs. Hartwell. I heard you calling her Beatrice yesterday. That's her first name, right? So I asked if I could call her something too. She said Ruth is her middle name and I could use that if I wanted." "You don't need to call her anything," Graham said more sharply than he intended. "She's not staying forever." Emmy's expression shuttered closed. "Of course not. Nobody stays forever." She left before Graham could respond. He found Beatrice in the kitchen, scrubbing potatoes for dinner. "Emmy wants to call you Ruth," he said. "I told her she could. Is that a problem?" "You're not her mother." "I never claimed to be." Beatrice didn't look up from her work. "But I am a person living in her house, caring for her and her brother. It seems reasonable that she might want to call me something other than Mrs. Hartwell or that woman." Graham felt the familiar frustration rising. "You're going to leave in 3 months. Why let her get attached?" "Why not? Attachment isn't weakness, Mr. Wade. It's connection. And that girl has been living in a house full of silence and grief for 3 years. If she wants to call me Ruth, I'm not going to tell her no just because you're afraid of what happens when I leave." "I'm not afraid." "Of course you are. You're terrified." Beatrice finally looked at him, her eyes steady and knowing. "You're terrified of losing someone else. You're terrified of your children needing someone other than you. You're terrified that if you let anyone in even a little bit, the grief you've been holding back will drown you. You don't know anything about me. I know enough. I know you loved your wife. I know you're barely holding yourself together. I know you drink yourself stupid some nights because I can smell it on you the next morning." She set down the potato and the brush. "But here's what you need to understand, Mr. Wade. I'm not Catherine. I'm not trying to be Catherine. I'm just trying to help a family that needs help. And if your daughter wants to call me Ruth, I'm going to let her, because that small kindness costs me nothing and gives her something she clearly needs." Graham had no answer to that. He left the kitchen feeling like he had lost an argument he hadn't known he was having. Saturday came bright and hot. They took the wagon into Willow Creek, all four of them. Graham drove. Beatrice sat beside him, her dress cleaned, and pressed her hair pinned back in a style that probably looked better in Boston than it did in Wyoming. Emmy and Toby sat in the back, Emmy chattering about the fair, Toby silent as always. Willow Creek was small, barely more than a wide spot in the road with a general store, a church, a saloon, and a handful of houses. But on fair days, it swelled to 3 times its size as ranchers and farmers came in from the surrounding territory to trade gossip and pretend for a few hours that civilization still existed out here on the edge of the world. The stares started the moment their wagon rolled into town. Graham felt them like physical things, eyes tracking Beatrice, mouths moving behind hands. He saw Mrs. Henderson, the pastor's wife, lean close to her friend and whisper something that made them both laugh. Beside him, Beatrice sat perfectly still, her chin up, her eyes forward. If she noticed the stares, she gave no sign. "Papa," Emmy said from the back, "why is everyone looking?" "Because they're bored and we're interesting," Beatrice said before Graham could answer. "Small towns are the same everywhere. They feed on other people's business because they don't have enough of their own." "That's not very charitable," Graham said. "Neither are they." She had a point. Graham helped her down from the wagon, feeling the weight of her as she gripped his hand for balance. Her palm was rough with calluses, her grip strong. "Thank you," she said, then walked toward the general store with her head high. Emmy took Toby's hand and followed. Graham trailed behind, acutely aware of the eyes on them, the whispers that followed in their wake. Inside the general store, Mr. Peterson greeted them with the professional courtesy of a man who would take anyone's money regardless of what he thought of them personally. Beatrice gave him a list of supplies that she must have been keeping in her head. Peterson read it, nodded, and began gathering items. "This is the woman, then?" Peterson asked Graham quietly while Beatrice was examining fabric near the back of the store. Her name is Mrs. Hartwell. I heard you sent for a mail order bride. Didn't expect. Peterson trailed off, his meaning clear. Didn't expect what? Nothing. None of my business. But Peterson's eyes went to Beatrice again, and Graham saw the judgment there, the assessment, the same look he had probably given her himself that first day. She's a good worker, Graham heard himself say. Better than most men I've known. I'm sure. Peterson's tone suggested he was sure of nothing of the kind. Graham paid for the supplies, loaded them into the wagon, and they moved on to the fair. It was set up in the open field behind the church with games for children, livestock pens for judging, and an auction platform for selling whatever anyone needed to sell. The crowd was thick, the air full of dust and sweat and the smell of roasting meat. Emmy wanted to see the horses. Toby had already disappeared behind his sister's skirts. Beatrice looked at the crowd with an expression Graham couldn't quite read. You don't have to stay, he said. If you'd rather wait by the wagon. Why would I do that? Because people are staring. Let them stare. I haven't done anything wrong and neither have you. But her jaw was tight, her hands clenched at her sides. They walked through the fair together, this strange temporary family. Graham nodded to people he knew, introduced Beatrice when forced to watch as the good people of Willow Creek measured her with their eyes and found her wanting. Then from the direction of the auction platform, a woman's scream cut through the afternoon noise like a knife. Graham's hand went to his hip, where a gun should have been, but wasn't, because you didn't wear weapons to church fairs, not unless you wanted trouble. The scream came again, higher and more desperate. He ran toward the sound, pushing through the crowd. Behind him, he heard Beatrice calling his name, heard Emmy's voice sharp with fear. But Graham was already focused on the scene unfolding in front of the auction platform. A child lay on the ground, small and dark-skinned and impossibly thin. A girl maybe 8 years old, wearing a dress that was little more than rags. Her body was rigid, convulsing foam at the corners of her mouth. Her eyes had rolled back in her head, and around her in a circle stood at least 40 people watching. Just watching. Someone help her, the woman who had screamed said. She was young, maybe 20, and holding a baby. Please, someone do something. Nobody moved. Graham dropped to his knees beside the child, his mind racing through everything he had learned in the army about seizures and fits and men dying in ways that medicine couldn't fix. Does anyone know her? He called out. That's one of God, a man said. Bert Holloway, a rancher from north of Graham's spread. Best let him handle it. Graham looked up at the circle of faces. She's dying. Not our problem, Bert said. That's Cobb's property. He's got papers. Property. The word hit Graham like a fist. He looked down at the child, at her stick-thin limbs, and the scars visible even through her torn dress, and something cold and terrible settled in his chest. The girl's convulsions were slowing. That wasn't good. That meant her body was giving up the fight. Graham tilted her head back, made sure her airway was clear, and began chest compressions the way he had been taught 20 years ago on a battlefield. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. The child's ribs felt like bird bones under his hands. Graham, what are you doing? Bert said. Saving her life. Someone get Dr. Morrison. Doc won't come for that, Bert said. She's Cobb's property. Let him deal with it. Graham ignored him, kept counting compressions, kept forcing air into lungs that felt like they wanted to stay collapsed. Behind him, he heard a heavy tread, felt a presence that was large and solid and somehow protective. Beatrice dropped to her knees beside him with a sound like a small avalanche. Her dress spread around her like a tent. What do you need? She asked, her voice steady. Keep the crowd back. Give us room. Beatrice stood again, using her body as a barrier. Her size suddenly an advantage as she forced the circle of onlookers to step back. Move, she said, and her voice carried a command that made people obey without thinking. Graham kept working, kept counting, kept breathing for this child who had no breath of her own. Come on, he thought. Come on, you stubborn little thing. Don't you quit. Don't you dare quit. The child's chest rose, fell, rose again, this time on its own. She coughed once, twice, then sucked in air like someone drowning who had finally broken the surface. Graham sat back on his heels, his hands shaking, his heart hammering against his ribs. The child's eyes fluttered open, dark and terrified and aware. You're all right, Graham said, though he had no idea if that was true. You're safe. Safe, a new voice deep and cold as winter. That child is mine, and she is anything but safe. Graham looked up. The man standing above him was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders like an ox and eyes the color of dirty ice. Jedediah Cobb. Graham knew him by reputation, though they had never spoken. Cobb ran a labor camp north of Willow Creek, took in orphans, and put them to work. Legal, according to the territorial magistrate. Moral, according to Pastor Williams, who preached about the virtues of hard work and discipline. Looking at this child, at the scars on her arms and the terror in her eyes, Graham was starting to question just how legal and moral Cobb's operation really was. "This child needs a doctor," Graham said, standing slowly. "This child needs discipline. She ran off 3 days ago. Wasted my time and money tracking her down." Cobb stepped forward, reaching for the girl. Graham moved to block him. "She's not going anywhere until Dr. Morrison examines her. She's my ward. I have legal guardianship." Cobb pulled a folded paper from his pocket, waved it like a flag. "Signed by Magistrate Harrison himself." "I don't care if it's signed by God. Look at her." Graham gestured at the child, who was trying to curl into a ball on the ground. "Does that look like proper care to you? That looks like a lazy, ungrateful child who needs to learn her place." Cobb's voice remained calm, almost pleasant, which somehow made it worse. "Now step aside, Wade, before you make this a legal matter." "Papa!" Emmy's voice small and scared. Graham turned to see his daughter standing at the edge of the crowd, Toby half hidden behind her. Emmy's eyes were on the child, wide and horrified. "Papa, can she come home with us?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Graham felt every eye in the crowd turned toward him, felt the weight of what his daughter was asking, what it would mean to say yes. "Emmy," he started. "Please, Papa, look at her. She needs help." Graham looked. The child was conscious now, sitting up, and in the daylight he could see things he had missed before. The way her dress hung on a frame that had almost no flesh. The scars that covered her exposed skin, some fresh, some old, all telling the same story. The absolute terror in her eyes as she looked at Cobb. "What's your name?" Graham asked her gently. The child's eyes flickered to Cobb, then back to Graham. "Ruth," she whispered. "Ruth Morrison." Ruth. Emmy wanted to call Beatrice by that name. Now here was another Ruth, small and broken and dying in the dirt. "Ruth," Graham said, making his decision even as he spoke. "Would you like to come with us? We have a doctor. We can make sure you're all right." "She's not going anywhere with you," Cobb said, his pleasant tone dropping away to reveal the iron underneath. "She's mine, legally mine. Then I'm stealing her." Graham bent down, scooped the child into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, 40 pounds at most. A child her age should have weighed 60, maybe more. "Sheriff Dawson can arrest me if he wants, but I'm taking this girl to Dr. Morrison right now." "Wade, you're making a mistake." Cobb's voice was soft, dangerous. "A very big mistake." "Probably." Graham started walking Ruth in his arms. The crowd parted for him. Nobody tried to stop him, but nobody helped either. They just watched the way they had watched her die. Beatrice fell into step beside him, her presence solid and reassuring. "The doctor's office is 3 blocks north," she said quietly. "I know where it is." "Of course you do. I'm just making sure you're thinking clearly." "I'm not thinking at all. If I was thinking, I'd put her down and walk away." "But you're not going to do that?" "No." Graham looked down at the child in his arms. Her eyes were closed now, her breathing shallow. "I'm not." Emmy and Toby followed, and behind them Graham could hear the murmurs of the crowd, the speculation and judgment. But he didn't look back. He just kept walking, carrying his burden toward whatever consequences awaited. Dr. Henry Morrison's office sat above the general store, reached by a narrow staircase that smelled of old wood and medicines. Graham took the stairs 2 at a time, Beatrice following more slowly behind him. Morrison was at his desk when Graham kicked open the door. The doctor was 58 years old, with gray hair and hands that shook slightly from too many years of cutting into flesh and trying to put the pieces back together. "Graham Wade," Morrison said, looking up. "What fresh hell have you brought me today?" "A child. She had some kind of seizure. She needs help." Morrison came around the desk and looked at Ruth in Graham's arms. His expression changed, hardened. "Where did you find her?" "At the fair. She collapsed. Nobody would help. Because everyone knows she belongs to Cobb, and nobody crosses Cobb if they can help it." Morrison gestured to the examination table. "Put her down, gently." Graham laid Ruth on the table. She made a small sound, something between a whimper and a sigh. Morrison began his examination, his touch surprisingly gentle for hands that looked so rough. Beatrice stood in the doorway, one hand pressed to her mouth. Emmy and Toby had stayed downstairs under strict orders not to follow. Morrison checked Ruth's eyes, her pulse listened to her chest through a stethoscope that had seen better days. Then he carefully lifted her dress, and Graham heard Beatrice's sharp intake of breath. Ruth's back was a map of violence. Scars layered over scars, some old and white, some fresh and red, some still weeping clear fluid that meant infection. Graham had seen men beaten in prison camps. He had seen soldiers whipped for desertion. He had never seen anything quite like this. "Dear God," Beatrice whispered. Morrison's jaw was tight. "This is what Cobb calls discipline. This is what our good magistrate signs papers to allow." He pulled Ruth's dress back down, covering the evidence. "She's severely malnourished, dehydrated. The seizure was probably brought on by a combination of both. And these wounds," he stopped, took a breath, "some of these are infected. Without treatment, she could develop sepsis." "Can you treat her?" Graham asked. "I can try. But Graham, you need to understand what you're getting into. Cobb has legal guardianship. He can demand that she be returned. And he will. He doesn't like being defied." "Let him try." Morrison looked at him for a long moment. "Your wife would be proud. She always had a soft spot for lost causes." The mention of Catherine hit Graham like a physical blow. He stepped back, needing distance, needing air. Morrison began pulling supplies from cabinets. Antiseptic bandages, medicines in bottles with labels Graham couldn't read. "This is going to take time. You might as well go get your other children. They shouldn't be left alone down there." Graham went. He found Emmy and Toby sitting on the stairs, Emmy's arm around her brother, both of them looking small and scared. "Is she going to be okay?" Emmy asked. "I don't know, sweetheart. The doctor's doing what he can. But she's coming home with us, right? She can stay with us." Graham crouched down to Emmy's level. "It's not that simple. The man who had her Cobb, he has legal papers that say she belongs to him. You can't let her go back. Papa, you saw what he did to her." "I know what I saw." "Then fight, the way Mama would have." The way Mama would have. Catherine had never been able to walk past suffering without trying to fix it. She had taken in injured animals, fed drifters, given away food they could barely spare. It had driven Graham crazy sometimes, her inability to harden herself against the world's pain. But it had also been what he loved most about her, that stubborn, stupid kindness. "If we keep her," Graham said slowly, "there's going to be trouble. Legal trouble, maybe worse. Cobb isn't the kind of man who forgives." "I don't care." Emmy's chin came up, so much like her mother. "She needs us." From beside her, Toby made a small sound. Both Graham and Emmy turned to look at him. Toby's eyes were wide, his mouth working as if trying to form words that wouldn't quite come. "Toby," Graham said gently. "She's scared," Toby whispered. His first words in 3 days, maybe the most important words he had ever spoken. "Like me, but nobody saved me." Graham felt something crack open in his chest. He pulled both his children close, held them tight. "Okay," he said. "Okay, we'll keep her. We'll figure it out." He went back upstairs to find Morrison washing his hands in a basin, while Beatrice sat beside Ruth holding the child's hand. Ruth's eyes were open now, looking around the room with the wariness of a trapped animal. "I've cleaned the wounds," Morrison said without turning around. "Started her on medication for the infection. She needs rest fluids and food. Small amounts frequently. Her stomach is probably too shrunk to handle much at once. I'll take her home," Graham said. "You're sure about this? Cobb will come for her?" "I'm sure." Morrison dried his hands, turned to face Graham. "Then you better be ready to fight, because Cobb doesn't lose. Ever. There's a first time for everything." Ruth's eye found Graham's face. "Are you really taking me?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "If you want to come." "I want." She struggled to sit up, winced as the movement pulled at her wounds. "But he'll find me. He always finds the ones who run." "Let him find you. He'll have to go through me to get you back." "And me," Beatrice said quietly. Ruth looked at Beatrice, really looked at her for the first time. "You're very big." "Yes, I am." "Are you an angel? The pictures in the church, the angels are always big, strong enough to protect people." Beatrice's eyes filled with tears. She blinked them back, but not before Graham saw them. No, sweetheart, I'm just a woman, but I will protect you. I promise. Promises don't mean nothing. Everyone breaks them. Not this one. Beatrice stood, her knees creaking. Mr. Wade, we should get her back to the ranch. It's a long ride and she needs rest. Graham lifted Ruth again, feeling the fragile weight of her. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains. The fair would be winding down, people heading home to their ranches and their normal lives. But Graham Wade's life had just become anything but normal. They loaded Ruth into the wagon bed, Beatrice arranging blankets to make her as comfortable as possible. Emmy and Toby climbed in beside her, Emmy already taking charge. Toby watching Ruth with the fascination of someone who had found another creature as damaged as himself. Graham took the reins. Beside him, Beatrice settled her bulk onto the bench seat. Neither of them spoke as they left Willow Creek behind, but Graham could feel the weight of what they had done pressing down on them both. They were halfway home when the riders appeared. Graham saw the dust first rising from the road behind them. 4 horses moving fast. He kept the wagon rolling, but his hand moved to the rifle under the seat. Is it him? Beatrice asked. Probably. The riders closed the distance quickly. Jedediah Cobb rode in front, his face a mask of cold fury. 3 men flanked him, all armed, all looking like the kind of men who did Cobb's dirty work without asking questions. Graham pulled the wagon to a stop. Stay in back, he told Emmy. Keep down. Papa, do what I say. Cobb reined in his horse 10 feet from the wagon. Wade, I believe you have something that belongs to me. I have a sick child who needs care. You have my legal ward taken without permission. That's theft. Call it what you want. She stays with me until Dr. Morrison clears her. Cobb smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. You're one man, Wade. I have 3 men with me, and I can get 30 more if I need them. You have 2 children, and... His eyes went to Beatrice. Whatever that is. Beatrice stood up in the wagon, her full height, making her imposing even next to mounted men. That is a woman who's tired of watching men like you hurt children. Sit down, fatty. Adults are talking. Make me. The challenge hung in the air. Graham saw Cobb's men shifting in their saddles, hands moving toward weapons. This was about to turn very bad very quickly. Enough, Graham said. He stood as well, the rifle now visible in his hands. Cobb, you want the girl back? You can file a complaint with Sheriff Dawson. Until then, she's under my protection. Your protection? Cobb laughed. You can't even protect yourself. This is Wyoming territory, Wade. Law matters. I have papers that say that girl is mine. You have nothing. I have this. Graham raised the rifle slightly, and I'm willing to use it. Threatening me in front of witnesses. But Cobb's smile had faded. He knew Graham well enough to know this wasn't a bluff. Not a threat, a promise. You come to my land, you threaten my family, you'll find out what I learned in the war. And what's that? How to kill men who need killing. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Finally, Cobb pulled his horse back. 2 weeks, Wade. I'll give you 2 weeks to come to your senses. After that, I'm coming back with the sheriff and a court order. And when I take that girl back, I'm going to make sure you watch what happens to her. So she knows, and you know, that kindness is weakness, and heroism is for fools. He wheeled his horse and rode away, his men following. Graham watched until they disappeared over the ridge, then slowly lowered the rifle. His hands were shaking. Papa, Emmy's voice small and scared from the back of the wagon. We're all right, Graham said, though he wasn't sure that was true. Beatrice sat back down heavily. He meant it, about coming back. I know. What are we going to do? Graham looked at Ruth curled in the wagon bed between his children, her eyes closed but her breathing still too fast, still too shallow. What had he done? What had he started? We're going to go home, he said finally. We're going to take care of her, and we're going to figure out how to win a fight we can't afford to lose. He snapped the reins and the wagon rolled forward, carrying them all toward whatever came next. The ranch felt different when they returned that evening. Graham couldn't quite name what had changed, only that the house he had lived in for 15 years now seemed smaller, more fragile, like a thing that could be taken away. He carried Ruth inside while Beatrice directed Emmy and Toby to prepare the spare bed, the one that had been collecting dust since Catherine died. Ruth weighed nothing in his arms. A child her age should have been squirming, protesting, asserting some kind of independence. Instead, she lay perfectly still, her body rigid with the kind of tension that spoke of long practice at making herself invisible. Here, Beatrice said, pulling back the quilts on the narrow bed, lay her down gently. Graham did. Ruth's eyes opened as her head touched the pillow, wet and dark, and filled with such profound distrust that it hurt to look at her. "You're safe here," Graham said the words, feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. Ruth said nothing. Her eyes moved from Graham to Beatrice to the window, calculating distances, measuring escape routes. A child of 8, and she was already thinking like a prisoner. Beatrice sat on the edge of the bed, the frame creaking under her weight. "Ruth, Dr. Morrison gave us medicine for you. It's going to taste terrible, but it will help with the infection. Will you take it?" Ruth's eyes went to the small brown bottle in Beatrice's hand. "What happens if I don't?" "You get sicker. The infection spreads. Eventually you die." Beatrice's voice was matter-of-fact, not cruel, just honest. "I won't force you, but I hope you'll choose to live." Ruth stared at her for a long moment. Then so quietly, Graham almost didn't hear it. "Okay." Beatrice measured out the medicine, helped Ruth sit up enough to swallow it. The child's face twisted at the taste, but she didn't cry, didn't complain. She just swallowed, lay back down, and closed her eyes as if shutting out the world. "She needs to eat," Beatrice said to Graham, "but her stomach can't handle much. I'll make broth." In the kitchen, Emmy was already working, heating water, gathering vegetables. She moved with the efficiency of someone twice her age, and Graham felt a familiar pang of guilt watching her. His daughter shouldn't have to be so competent, so self-sufficient. She should be allowed to be a child. "Is Ruth going to stay?" Emmy asked without looking up from the cutting board. "For now. And when Mr. Cobb comes back, we'll deal with that when it happens." "That's not an answer, Papa." Graham had no better one to give. He went to his room, closed the door, and allowed himself exactly 5 minutes to sit on the edge of his bed and wonder what in God's name he had gotten his family into. Then he stood up, straightened his shoulders, and went back to work. The first night was long. Ruth woke screaming 3 times, dreams that Graham could only imagine tearing through her sleep. Each time Beatrice was there first, somehow managing to move her bulk with surprising speed and grace. She would sit beside Ruth, humming something low and wordless, until the child's breathing slowed and sleep claimed her again. The third time it happened, Graham found Emmy standing in the hallway, her face pale in the lamplight. "Can't you do something?" Emmy asked. "Make her stop." "She's remembering," Graham said. "You can't make someone stop remembering." "It's loud. Toby's scared." "I know, but she's scared too. More scared than we can probably understand." Emmy's expression softened slightly. "I'm going to sit with her. Maybe it will help if someone's there when she wakes up." She went into Ruth's room before Graham could stop her. Through the open door, he watched his daughter climb carefully onto the bed, positioning herself near Ruth, but not touching, just being present. A sentinel in a nightgown, standing watch against demons she couldn't see. Graham went back to his own room, but didn't sleep. He sat by the window, his rifle across his knees, watching the road that led to his ranch. Cobb had said 2 weeks. Graham believed him. Men like Cobb didn't make idle threats. They made promises, and they kept them. Morning came slow and gray. Graham rose before dawn, as he always did, and found Beatrice already in the kitchen. She had bags under her eyes that spoke of a sleepless night, but her hands were steady as she kneaded dough for bread. "She needs a bath," Beatrice said without preamble. "Those wounds need to be cleaned properly. But I'll need help. She's terrified, and I don't want to force her." "What do you need from me?" "Stay close, in case she runs. She's small, but fear makes people strong." They woke Ruth gently. Emmy helped her presence, seeming to calm the younger girl in ways that Graham's didn't. Together, they got Ruth to the small bathing room where Beatrice had heated water and laid out clean cloths. Ruth stood in the corner, trembling, her arms wrapped around herself. "I'm not going to hurt you," Beatrice said, "but I need to clean your wounds. The infection is getting worse. Do you understand?" Ruth nodded, her eyes on the floor. "I need you to undress. Emmy will help you. Is that all right?" Another nod, smaller this time. Graham left them to it, going outside where the air was clean and the work was simple. He mended fence until he heard Emmy calling his name, her voice high and urgent. He ran back to the house, his heart hammering. In the bathing room, Ruth sat in the metal tub, the water around her pink with blood and pus from infected wounds. She was sobbing, the kind of crying that came from deep in the chest, full of pain and terror, and something that might have been relief. Beatrice knelt beside the tub. Her dress soaked her large hands gentle as they cleaned wounds that should never have existed on a child's body. Emmy stood to the side holding towels, her face wet with tears. "I'm sorry," Ruth kept saying. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." "You have nothing to be sorry for," Beatrice said. Her voice was steady, but Graham could see the fury in the set of her jaw, the way her hands shook slightly when they weren't actively working. "None of this is your fault. Do you hear me? None of it." Ruth just cried harder. It took an hour to clean her properly. By the end, the water was dark and Ruth was exhausted, slumped against the side of the tub like something boneless. Beatrice lifted her out, wrapped her in clean towels that were soft from years of use. "There," Beatrice said. "That's the worst of it. You were very brave." "I wasn't brave, I just sat there." Sometimes sitting still is the bravest thing you can do. They dressed Ruth in one of Emmy's old nightgowns, hemmed quickly to fit her smaller frame. Emmy brushed Ruth's hair with the same gentle care Beatrice had shown cleaning her wounds. And slowly, so slowly, Graham almost didn't see it happen, Ruth began to relax. That afternoon, Sheriff John Dawson rode up to the ranch. Graham saw him coming from a mile away, the dust trail like a question mark hanging in the air. Dawson was 46 years old with a face weathered by sun and wind and 30 years of trying to maintain order in a place that didn't much believe in it. He had been sheriff of Willow Creek for 12 years, and in all that time, Graham had never seen him do anything more strenuous than break up bar fights and arrest drunks. "Graham," Dawson said, dismounting slowly. His knees popped audibly. "We need to talk. I figured you'd come. Cobb filed a complaint, says you stole his property. I saved a dying child. That child is his legal ward. He's got papers, Graham, signed by Magistrate Harrison himself." Graham leaned against the porch rail, his arms crossed. "You've seen kids from Cobb's camp before. You know what he does to them." "What I know and what I can prove are two different things." Dawson pulled off his hat, wiped sweat from his forehead. "I'm in a difficult position here. The law is clear. Cobb has guardianship. You're harboring his ward without permission. Technically, that's kidnapping. Technically, Cobb is torturing children. But I don't see you arresting him, because he hasn't broken any laws. The magistrate reviewed his operation last year, said everything was above board. The magistrate is either blind or bought." Graham's voice was hard. "Did you know Harrison gets $50 for every guardianship he signs over to Cobb, $50 per child? How many children has he signed over in the last 2 years?" Dawson's face went carefully blank. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. Everyone knows. They just don't care enough to do anything about it." Dawson was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the mountains like they held answers he couldn't find. "What do you want from me, Graham? You want me to throw away my career over this? You want me to go against a magistrate and a man with more money and connections than God, for what? For one child. Yes. That's not enough. It should be." Dawson put his hat back on, settled it with the careful precision of a man buying time to think. "I can give you 2 weeks. That's it. After that, I have to enforce the court order. Cobb's already filed for an emergency hearing. Judge Harrison is presiding. It's set for Boulder 2 weeks from today. Harrison can't preside. He's got a financial interest in the outcome. You'll have to prove that, which means you'll need a lawyer, a good one." Dawson mounted his horse, looked down at Graham with something that might have been sympathy. "I'm sorry, Graham. I truly am. But the law is the law. The law is wrong. Then change it. But you've got 2 weeks to do it." Dawson turned his horse. "And Graham, be ready. When Cobb comes, he won't come alone." Graham watched the sheriff ride away, dust rising in his wake like smoke from a funeral pyre. Behind him, the screen door creaked. Beatrice stepped out onto the porch, her face drawn. "I heard," she said. 2 weeks isn't enough time." "Then we make it enough." Beatrice sat down on the steps, the wood groaning under her weight. "I have money, not much but some. $400 saved from my years in service. It's sewn into the lining of my traveling dress. We can use it for a lawyer." Graham stared at her. "That's your safety net. If things don't work out here, if I send you away after 3 months, you'll need that money." "I'm not going to need it, because I'm not leaving." Beatrice's voice was firm. "Not in 3 months, not in 3 years. I came here looking for a transaction, Mr. Wade. But what I found is something worth fighting for. A family that needs help. A child who deserves justice. I'm staying, and I'm helping, whether you want me to or not. Graham felt the ice around his heart beginning to crack the numbness he'd carried for 3 years, starting to give way to something warmer. He sat down beside Beatrice close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet. We still have to win." That evening, a wagon rolled up to the ranch. Graham tensed, reaching for his rifle until he recognized the driver. Margaret Whitmore was 54 years old, wealthy by local standards, and known for speaking her mind regardless of who it offended. She had been widowed 5 years ago, and since then had devoted her considerable energy to various causes and crusades. "Mr. Wade," she called from the wagon, "I heard what you did at the fair. Might I have a word?" Graham approached cautiously. In the back of Margaret's wagon sat 3 men, all looking uncomfortable and out of place. "These are my sons," Margaret said. "John, Paul, and Matthew. They're here to help with your fortification." "My what?" "Your fortification. Cobb will come for that child. You need to be ready. My boys are good with tools. They'll help you prepare." Margaret climbed down from the wagon with the brisk efficiency of someone who had never waited for help in her life. "And I've sent word to Thomas Sterling in Denver. He's a lawyer, a good one, specializes in fighting injustice. If anyone can beat Cobb in court, it's Sterling." Graham found his voice. "Mrs. Whitmore, I appreciate the offer, but I can't pay you back. Not for the lawyer, not for the help." "I'm not asking you to." Margaret's eyes were hard and bright. "My husband Samuel died 5 years ago. Before he died, he was investigating Cobb's operation. He found evidence of abuse of children, dying of magistrates being paid to look the other way. He was going to expose all of it." She paused, her jaw tight. "Then he had an accident. His wagon went off the road on a clear day with a sober driver. They never found out why. You think Cobb killed him. I can't prove it. But yes, I think Cobb killed him, or had him killed, which amounts to the same thing." Margaret's hands clenched into fists. "So no, Mr. Wade, I don't want payment. I want justice for my husband. And if helping you helps me get that, then we both win." Graham looked at the 3 sons, all young and strong, and clearly eager to do something, anything to help. He thought about Ruth inside the house, about Emmy and Toby, about Beatrice and the promise she had made to stay. He thought about the 2 weeks ticking away like a clock counting down to disaster. "All right," he said. "Thank you. We'll take the help." The next 3 days were a blur of activity. Margaret's sons helped Graham board up windows, reinforce doors, dig rifle pits around the property. It felt melodramatic, like preparation for a siege that might never come. But Graham had learned in the war that preparation was the difference between survival and death, and he wasn't taking chances with his family's safety. Beatrice worked alongside them, her strength surprising the men, until they learned not to underestimate her. She could lift boards they struggled with, could dig as deep as anyone, could work through the heat without complaint. By the end of the second day, Margaret's sons were treating her with the same respect they showed their mother. Ruth watched from the window, her face pale and drawn. She was healing physically, the wounds on her back beginning to close the infection, retreating under the assault of Morrison's medicine. But emotionally, she remained locked away, speaking only when spoken to, never smiling, never playing with Emmy and Toby, despite their gentle attempts to include her. On the 4th day, Emmy found Graham in the barn. "Papa," she said, "Ruth won't talk to me. I've tried everything. I showed her my dolls I offered to teach her to read. I even let her wear my favorite dress. She just sits there staring at nothing." "She's been through things we can't imagine, Emmy. It takes time to heal from that." "I know, but I want to help. I want her to know she's safe." Graham put down the harness he was mending, pulled his daughter close. "You are helping, just by being kind, by being patient. That's more than most people would do." "Is it enough?" "I don't know, sweetheart. I hope so." That night, Graham was woken by voices. He grabbed his rifle, his heart hammering, and crept toward the sound. What he found was Ruth and Beatrice in the kitchen, sitting at the table with mugs of warm milk between them. "I can't sleep," Ruth was saying. "Every time I close my eyes, I'm back there, in the shed, in the cold, listening to Samuel scream." "Who was Samuel?" Beatrice asked gently. "A boy. He was 10. He tried to run away. Ruth's voice was flat, emotionless, reciting facts. Mr. Cobb caught him, had his men beat Samuel until he couldn't walk, then locked him in the punishment shed. It was January. No heat, no blanket. We heard Samuel crying all night, begging to be let out. In the morning, it was quiet. Beatrice's hands tightened around her mug. What happened? Mr. Cobb opened the door. Samuel was dead, frozen solid. His eyes were still open. Ruth finally looked up at Beatrice. Mr. Cobb made us look, all of us, said that's what happens to runners, said if we were smart, we'd learn the lesson. How old were you? 6. I was 6 years old. Beatrice closed her eyes, her face a mask of pain. When she opened them again, there were tears on her cheeks. Ruth, I need you to understand something. What happened to Samuel? What happened to you? None of that was your fault, and it wasn't normal. It wasn't discipline or education or any of the things Cobb probably told you it was. It was evil, pure evil. I know that now, but back then I thought maybe we deserved it. Maybe we were bad like he said. You were children. Children can't be bad enough to deserve torture. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Are you going to let him take me back? No. How can you stop him? He has the law on his side. Then we'll change the law, or we'll break it, or we'll run so far he can never find us. Beatrice reached across the table, took Ruth's small hand in her large one. I promised you I'd protect you. I don't break promises. Everyone breaks promises. Not me, and not Mr. Wade. We're going to fight for you, Ruth. In court if we can, other ways if we must, but we're not letting you go back to that hell. Ruth looked at their joined hands, at the contrast between Beatrice's pale, scarred fingers and her own dark, too thin ones. Why, you don't even know me. I know enough. I know you survived things that would have killed most people. I know you're brave and strong and deserving of so much better than you've gotten. Beatrice's voice cracked. And I know what it's like to be told you're worthless because of how you look, to be judged before you ever open your mouth, to be seen as less than human because you don't fit someone's idea of acceptable. Because you're fat. Yes, because I'm fat. People have been cruel to me my entire life, called me lazy, disgusting, unworthy of love or respect. And I let it make me small on the inside even as my body grew large. I let it convince me I deserved less than others, that I should be grateful for whatever scraps of kindness anyone threw my way. Beatrice's grip tightened. But watching what you survived, it reminded me of something important. We're not what they say we are. We're what we choose to be. And I choose to be someone who fights for children like you. Someone who stands up to men like Cobb. Someone worthy of the trust you're giving me right now. Ruth's eyes filled with tears. They spilled over, running down her cheeks the first time Graham had seen her cry since they brought her home. Beatrice stood, came around the table, and pulled Ruth into her arms. The child disappeared against Beatrice's bulk, hidden and protected and safe. Graham backed away quietly, leaving them to their moment. He returned to his room, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, he sat by the window watching the stars wheel overhead and thought about promises and the price of keeping them. The next morning brought Thomas Sterling. The lawyer arrived in a hired coach, looking out of place in his Eastern clothes and polished shoes. He was 40 years old, lean and sharp-eyed, with the kind of intensity that suggested he had never met a fight he didn't want to pick. Mr. Wade, Sterling said, shaking Graham's hand with a grip that was surprisingly strong. Mrs. Whitmore sent me, said you had a case worth fighting. I have a child worth protecting. Whether that's a case the law cares about, I don't know. Let me be the judge of that. Where's the girl? They found Ruth in the kitchen with Beatrice learning how to knead bread. Her hands were covered in flour, her face slightly less haunted than it had been days before. When she saw Sterling, she froze. It's all right, Graham said quickly. This is Mr. Sterling. He's a lawyer. He's here to help. Sterling knelt down, putting himself at Ruth's eye level. Hello, Ruth. I need to ask you some questions. They might be difficult. They might make you remember things you'd rather forget. But I need the truth, all of it, if I'm going to help keep you safe. Can you do that? Ruth looked at Beatrice, who nodded encouragingly. Then slowly Ruth nodded too. They spent the next 3 hours at the kitchen table while Sterling took notes in a leather-bound book. He asked questions gently but thoroughly, never flinching at the answers, never showing shock or disgust, even when the details Ruth shared were horrifying. He asked about the work schedule, the punishments, the other children, the ones who had died. Ruth answered in a voice that got smaller and smaller until it was barely a whisper, but she answered. Every question, every horror, she shared it all. When it was finally over, Ruth's face was gray with exhaustion. Beatrice took her to bed while Sterling sat back in his chair, his expression grim. Well, Graham asked. It's bad. Worse than I expected. Sterling closed his notebook. Cobb has been running in that camp for 6 years. In that time, at least 20 children have passed through. Ruth can name 14 who died. That's not accidents, Mr. Wade. That's systematic murder. Can you prove it? Not without more evidence. Ruth's testimony is powerful, but she's a child and a Negro child at that. No offense, but juries don't put much weight on testimony from children, especially when it contradicts a white man with money and connections. What do we need? Sterling was quiet for a moment, thinking. We need other witnesses, adults if possible. We need documentation, records of guardianship payment, records, anything that shows a pattern. And most importantly, we need to prove that Magistrate Harrison is corrupt. If we can show he was taking bribes to sign over children, his guardianship papers become invalid. How do we prove that? I don't know yet, but I'll figure it out. That's what you're paying me for. We can't pay much. Mrs. Whitmore is covering half. For the rest, we'll work something out. Sterling stood, gathered his papers. I'm going back to Denver to start filing motions. We have 12 days until the hearing. That's not much time, but it's what we've got. Use it wisely. After Sterling left, Graham found Beatrice on the porch. She was staring at the horizon, her face troubled. What are you thinking? Graham asked. I'm thinking we need more than legal arguments. We need proof, real concrete proof of what Cobb is doing. The only proof is at his camp, and there's no way to get it without breaking in. Beatrice turned to look at him. I know. I've been thinking about it all afternoon. That's insane. Cobb has men, guards. It would be suicide. It would be risky, but so is going into court with nothing but a child's word against a man with money and power. Beatrice's jaw was set in a way Graham was beginning to recognize. I'm not suggesting you do it. You have children to think about. But I don't. I could go. Absolutely not. Why not? Because I'm a woman, because I'm fat. I'm probably stronger than half the men in this territory. Because I'm not sending anyone into that kind of danger. Not for me, not for Ruth, not for anyone. Beatrice was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, what if we had help? The next day, a young man arrived at the ranch on foot, looking half-starved and terrified. Graham met him at the edge of the property, rifle raised. Don't shoot, the man set his hands up. My name is Daniel Reeves. I work for Cobb. Worked for Cobb. Past tense. I left yesterday. Graham kept the rifle pointed at him. Wipe out. Because I can't do it anymore. Can't watch children suffer. Can't bury bodies. Can't live with what I've done. Daniel's voice cracked. I heard you took Ruth Morrison. I heard you're fighting Cobb in court. I can help. I can testify. I know where the bodies are buried. I know the system. I know everything. And why should I trust you? You shouldn't. I'm a monster. I've been done terrible things, but maybe, Daniel's hands were shaking, maybe I can do one good thing before I die. Maybe I can help save the others. Graham called for Beatrice. She came out, took one look at Daniel, and her face went hard. You, she said, I know you. You were there when Cobb beat children. I saw you through the window when I went to the camp. Yes, ma'am, I was there. I held them down. Daniel broke down, tears streaming down his face. I know sorry isn't enough. I know I can't undo what I've done, but I can stop it from happening to others. Please, let me try. Beatrice looked at Graham. He saw the conflict in her eyes, the desire to turn this man away, warring with the knowledge that they needed him. Ruth has to agree, Beatrice said finally. If she says no, you leave and never come back. They brought Ruth out. When she saw Daniel, she went white, backing up until she hit the porch rail. No, she whispered. No, please, he's one of them. I know, Beatrice said, kneeling beside Ruth. I know what he did, but he says he wants to help now. He knows things that could put Cobb in prison forever. Should we listen? He hurt me. He held me down while Mr. Cobb. Ruth couldn't finish. Daniel fell to his knees. I did. I did all of it, and I'll burn in hell for it. But before I do, I want to help. I want to make sure no other child goes through what you went through. Please, let me try to be better than I was. Ruth looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at Beatrice, at Graham at the ranch that had become her sanctuary. Okay, she whispered, but I don't forgive you. I don't expect you to. I don't deserve it. They put Daniel in the barn with strict instructions that he was not to approach Ruth without permission. That night, Graham, Beatrice, and Daniel sat around the kitchen table while Daniel drew a map of Cobb's property. The main house is here, Daniel said, marking an X. Cobb's bedroom is on the second floor east side. He keeps a ledger there. Every punishment, every child, every payment. It's all written down. He's meticulous about record keeping. How do we get to it? Beatrice asked. The night guard rotates every 4 hours. Between midnight and 4 a.m., there's only one man watching the children's quarters. If we can distract him, someone could slip into the main house. Someone small and quiet, Graham said, which rules out both of us. It rules out you, Beatrice corrected, but I grew up in a house with creaky floors and parents who didn't appreciate noise. I know how to move quietly when I need to. You're not going alone. Then come with me. We'll need Margaret's help too, someone to keep watch to signal if there's trouble. Graham wanted to say no. Every instinct told him this was too dangerous, too risky, that the potential cost far outweighed the potential benefit. But when he thought about facing Cobb in court with nothing but Ruth's testimony and Sterling's legal maneuvering, he knew it wasn't enough. All right, he said, but we plan this carefully. No improvisation, no heroics. We get in, get the ledger, get out. Anything goes wrong, we abort. Beatrice's hand found his across the table, her grip firm and warm. Thank you for trusting me. Don't make me regret it. They planned for 2 days. Daniel provided every detail he could remember about the camp's layout, the guards' routines, Cobb's habits. Margaret agreed to help, though she insisted on bringing her sons as backup. Graham reluctantly agreed, knowing they needed all the help they could get. On the night of the 11th day, they set out. Graham, Beatrice, Daniel, and Margaret leaving Emmy in charge of Ruth and Toby, with strict instructions to hide in the root cellar if anyone came to the ranch. The ride to Cobb's camp took 3 hours. They left the horses a mile away and approached on foot using the darkness and Daniel's knowledge of the patrol patterns to avoid detection. The camp was larger than Graham had expected. A main house solid and well built. A barn that had been converted into sleeping quarters for the children. Several smaller outbuildings. And in the north field, exactly where Daniel had said it would be, a section of disturbed earth that looked like it had been dug and filled many times. The burial ground, Daniel whispered. 14 children. I helped bury 8 of them. Graham felt his stomach turn. Looking at that field, knowing what lay beneath, he understood in a way he hadn't before just how monstrous Cobb truly was. Margaret positioned herself at the tree line with a lantern. 1 flash meant proceed, 2 meant danger, 3 meant run. Graham and Beatrice waited while Daniel approached the guard, a man he knew, and struck up a conversation. The guard was young, easily distracted, and after 5 minutes of talking about nothing, he walked with Daniel to the far side of the property to share a flask of whiskey. Now, Graham whispered. They moved quickly across the open ground, Beatrice surprisingly light on her feet despite her size. The main house was dark except for a single lamp burning in a downstairs window. Graham tried the back door. Locked. Beatrice pulled a hairpin from her pocket, worked it into the lock with practiced ease. Boston skill, she murmured. Long story. The door opened with barely a whisper of sound. Inside, the house smelled of tobacco and old wood. They made their way upstairs, each step carefully placed, each creak of the floorboards sounding like thunder in the silence. Cobb's bedroom was the third door on the left. Graham's heart was hammering so hard he was certain it would wake the entire camp. Beatrice tried the door handle. Unlocked. They slipped inside. The room was sparse but well appointed. A large bed, a wardrobe, a desk by the window. On the desk, exactly where Daniel had said it would be, sat a leather-bound ledger. Beatrice grabbed it, tucked it under her arm. They were turning to leave when they heard footsteps in the hallway. Graham froze. There was nowhere to hide, no time to run. The footsteps were coming closer, deliberate and slow. Then they stopped right outside the door. Graham's hand went to the knife at his belt. If Cobb opened that door, Graham would have to act and act fast. He couldn't let Cobb raise an alarm. He couldn't let Beatrice be caught. The door handle turned. Beatrice grabbed Graham's arm, pulled him toward the window. It was a 20-foot drop to the ground below, possibly survivable, possibly fatal. The door opened, but it wasn't Cobb. It was a woman, middle-aged, black, wearing a servant's dress. She saw them, her eyes going wide. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then the woman put a finger to her lips, stepped into the room, and closed the door behind her. "You're here for evidence," she whispered. It wasn't a question. Graham nodded, not trusting his voice. "Good. Take the ledger, but there's more. In the cellar, he keeps the original guardianship documents, the ones that show Harrison's signatures and the payment records." She pulled a key from her pocket, pressed it into Beatrice's hand. "I'm Eliza. I cook for him. I've wanted to burn this place down for 5 years. This is the next best thing." "Why help us?" Beatrice asked. "Because I watched my own son die in that field. Cobb said he ran away, found a new family out west. But I know the truth. I heard the screams. I saw the blood." Eliza's face was stone. "Burn him down, please." They made their way to the cellar, hearts pounding, every shadow a potential threat. The documents were there exactly as Eliza had said. Guardianship papers, payment records, letters between Cobb and Harrison, discussing prices per child. It was all there. Everything they needed. They were almost out when the alarm bell rang. Someone had discovered them. Shouts erupted across the camp, lanterns flaring to life. Graham grabbed Beatrice's hand, ran for the door. They burst out into the night to find Margaret's lantern flashing 3 times. "Run. Run now," they ran. Across the field, past the burial ground, into the trees where Margaret waited with the horses. Behind them, Cobb's voice roared commands, men scrambling to saddle horses and give chase. They rode hard through the night, the documents and ledgers secured in saddlebags, pursued by men who wanted them dead. At one point, shots rang out, bullets whining past Graham's head, close enough to feel the wind of their passage. But they had good horses and a head start. By the time dawn broke, they had lost their pursuers in the maze of canyons and ridges that marked the boundary of Graham's land. They arrived back at the ranch exhausted and exhilarated. Emmy and Ruth emerged from the root cellar safe and unharmed. Toby clung to Graham's leg, refusing to let go. Thomas Sterling arrived that afternoon, summoned by a message Margaret had sent ahead. He took the documents, the ledger, spread them across the kitchen table with something like reverence. "This is it," he said. "This is everything. Payment records that match exactly with guardianship dates. Letters discussing prices. Cobb's own handwriting documenting punishments, deaths, burials." Sterling's hands were shaking. "With this, we can destroy him. We can destroy Harrison. We can burn down their entire operation." "And keep Ruth safe?" Graham asked. "And keep Ruth safe." That night they celebrated quietly. A good meal, the first in days that Graham could actually taste. Laughter genuine and unforced. Ruth even smiled just once when Toby told a joke he had been saving for weeks. Graham found Beatrice on the porch after the children had gone to bed. She sat on the steps, looking at the stars, her face peaceful. "You were incredible tonight," Graham said, sitting beside her. "I don't think I've ever seen anyone move that fast." Fear is a powerful motivator. It wasn't fear. It was courage. Graham paused, choosing his words carefully. "I need to tell you something. When we're in that room, when Cobb's footsteps were coming toward the door, I realized something. I realized that losing you would hurt almost as much as losing Catherine did." Beatrice turned to look at him, her eyes wide in the starlight. "I know it's only been 2 weeks," Graham continued. "I know we barely know each other. But somewhere in all of this, you became essential. Not just to the children. To me." He took a breath. "I'm asking you to stay. Not as hired help, not as a transaction, as my wife. For real, if you'll have me." Beatrice was quiet for so long that Graham thought he had ruined everything. Then she laughed, a sound full of surprise and and something that might have been relief. "You're proposing to me the night we committed multiple felonies together. Seemed like as good a time as any. Graham Wade, you are the most ridiculous man I've ever met." She took his hand in both of hers. "Yes, of course, yes. I came here expecting a business arrangement and found a family instead. I'm not leaving. Not now. Not ever." They kissed awkward and sweet and real. When they pulled apart, Ruth was standing in the doorway watching them with an expression Graham couldn't quite read. "Ruth," Beatrice said, "what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, I just—" Ruth's voice was small. "Can I call you Mama B and Papa Graham? Is that allowed?" Graham felt his throat close up, tears burning his eyes. Beatrice was already crying, holding out her arms. Ruth ran to them, and they held her together, this child they had chosen who had chosen them. "Yes," Graham managed to say. "Yes, you can call us that. Even if the judge says I have to go back." "You're not going back. We're going to win. I promise you." Ruth looked up at him, her eyes still haunted but holding something new. Hope. Just a small spark of it, but hope nonetheless. "Kay," she whispered, "I believe you." The next morning, Sheriff Dawson arrived with grim news. Cobb had filed assault charges against Graham and Beatrice for the break-in. There was a warrant for their arrest. "I can delay executing it until after the hearing," Dawson said, "but that's all I can do. After that, you'll have to face those charges." "We'll deal with it," Graham said. Dawson looked at Ruth, who was helping Beatrice in the kitchen. "Was it worth it? All this trouble, all this risk for one child?" "Yes," Graham said with weird hesitation, "it was worth it." 2 days before the hearing, Pastor Williams came to the ranch. He looked uncomfortable, his collar too tight, his hands fidgeting with his hat. "Mr. Wade," he said, "I've come to apologize. For my silence, for my inaction. Cobb has been donating to our church for years. I told myself that his money did good work, that what happened at his camp was legal and therefore acceptable. I was wrong." "Yes," Graham said, "you were. I want to testify at the hearing. I want to tell the court what I know, what I should have spoken up about years ago." Graham studied the pastor's face, looking for sincerity, for the kind of courage that came late, but came nonetheless. He found it. "Thank you," Graham said. "That means more than you know." The day before the hearing, the entire ranch seemed to hold its breath. Sterling arrived with final preparations, going over Ruth's testimony one last time, preparing her for the questions that would come. "They're going to try to break you," Sterling said gently. "Cobb's lawyer will call you a liar, will say you're coached, will try to make you cry. Can you stay strong?" Ruth looked at Graham, at Beatrice, at Emmy and Toby, who had become her siblings. "I can do anything if it means I get to stay with them." That night, Margaret Whitmore organized an impromptu ceremony. She had gotten herself ordained through some mail-order church, and she stood in Graham's living room with a Bible in her hands and a smile on her face. "Dearly beloved," she began, and Graham felt his heart swell with an emotion he couldn't name. The ceremony was brief. Emmy and Ruth stood as witnesses, both holding hands, both crying. Toby held the simple silver rings that Graham had bought in town, so proud and serious that Graham thought his heart might burst. When Margaret pronounced them married, truly married, Beatrice kissed Graham with a tenderness that made the world fade away. For just that moment, there was no trial, no danger, no uncertainty. Just this, just them. Afterward, Ruth asked if they could all make a promise together. They stood in a circle, hands joined, and Ruth spoke words that Graham would remember for the rest of his life. "Promise that no matter what happens tomorrow, we're still family. Even if the judge makes me go back, you'll still be my family in my heart. Right?" "We promise," Graham said, his voice breaking. "You're a Wade now, Ruth, forever." They held each other close while the fire crackled and the night grew deep around them. Outside, the wind carried the smell of rain, the promise of a storm. But inside, for one last night, they were safe. They were together. They were home. Tomorrow would bring the trial, the judgment, the moment when everything they had fought for would be decided by 12 strangers in a courtroom far from here. But tonight they had each other. And somehow that was enough. Graham stood at the window long after everyone else had gone to bed, watching the road that led to his ranch, thinking about promises and the cost of keeping them. Beside him, Beatrice appeared, her presence solid and reassuring. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking about the last promise I made. To Catherine as she died. That I would raise our children right. That I would keep them safe." Graham paused. "I thought that was the last promise I would ever make. But tonight I made a new one. To Ruth. To protect her no matter what it costs." "And you'll keep it," Beatrice said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, even if it means going to prison. Even if it means losing everything. I'll keep it." Beatrice took his hand. "Then let's make sure it doesn't come to that. Let's go to Boulder and fight like hell. We don't have much chance of winning. We have the truth. We have evidence. We have a lawyer who believes in us. Beatrice's grip tightened. And we have something Cobb doesn't have. We have love. Real love. The kind that doesn't quit. That has to count for something. I hope you're right. I am right, you'll see. They went to bed together for the first time as husband and wife and held each other through the night. Outside, the storm broke at last, rain drumming on the roof like the hoofbeats of approaching horses. Tomorrow would bring the fight of their lives. But tonight they had this moment, this peace, this small rebellion against all the darkness waiting beyond their door. And it was enough. The morning of the trial came cold and gray, as if the sky itself knew what was at stake. Graham woke before dawn, his body tense with anticipation and dread. Beside him, Beatrice was already awake, staring at the ceiling, with eyes that suggested she hadn't slept at all. "Ready?" she asked quietly. "No," Graham said, "but we're going anyway." They dressed in their best clothes, what passed for formal, in a place where formal meant clean and without visible patches. Ruth wore the blue dress Beatrice had made for her hair braided in a crown around her head. She looked small and fragile and impossibly brave. The ride to Boulder took 4 hours. They traveled together, all of them. Graham and Beatrice in front, Emmy, Toby, and Ruth in the back of the wagon. Margaret Whitmore followed in her own coach with Thomas Sterling, going over last-minute strategies preparing for battle. Boulder was the biggest town Graham had visited in years, with actual paved streets and buildings that rose 3 stories high. The courthouse sat at the center like a monument to civilization's ability to pretend it cared about justice. People stared as they made their way through town. A cowboy in worn boots and a woman so large she made the wagon tilt. A child who was clearly not theirs by blood, her dark skin marking her as different in a town that didn't much care for difference. Graham felt the weight of their judgment, but kept his eyes forward, his jaw set. The courtroom was already packed when they arrived. Ranchers and shopkeepers, people from Willow Creek and beyond, all come to see the spectacle. Some wore expressions of sympathy. Others looked openly hostile. Most just looked curious, the way people always were when someone else's tragedy played out in public. Jedediah Cobb sat at the defense table, flanked by his lawyer, Ambrose Morrison. Cobb looked prosperous and confident, his suit expensive, his demeanor that of a man who had never lost a fight and didn't expect to start now. When he saw Graham, he smiled. It was the smile of a predator who knew the prey was trapped. Judge William Harrison sat on the bench, old and stern, and already looking impatient. Graham felt his stomach sink. Harrison was the one who had signed the guardianship papers. Harrison was the one taking money from Cobb. There was no way this would be a fair trial. Sterling saw Graham's expression and leaned close. "I know, but we have to try. Sometimes all you can do is show the corruption for what it is and hope someone cares. And if they don't, then we appeal. And if that fails, we run. But let's fight first." The bailiff called the court to order. Judge Harrison banged his gavel, the sound like a gunshot in the crowded room. "This is a hearing to determine the custody of the minor child, Ruth Morrison." Harrison said, his voice carrying no warmth. "Mr. Cobb has petitioned the court to enforce his legal guardianship. Mr. Wade opposes this petition. Mr. Sterling, you may begin." Thomas Sterling stood, his movements precise and controlled. "Your Honor, the prosecution will prove 3 things. First, that Jedediah Cobb tortured children under the guise of discipline. Second, that 14 children died at his camp and were buried illegally. Third, that he obtained guardianship through fraud and bribery involving this very court." The murmur that went through the courtroom was like wind through tall grass. Harrison's face went red. "Mr. Sterling, you will watch your accusations." "They're not accusations, Your Honor, they're facts, and I have evidence to prove every word." Ambrose Morrison rose smooth as oil. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. Mr. Sterling is attempting to turn a simple custody matter into a circus. My client is a respected businessman who has devoted his life to caring for unwanted children. The fact that one ungrateful child, coached by outside agitators, has concocted lies should not be grounds for this witch hunt." "I'll be the judge of what's grounds for what," Harrison snapped. "Mr. Sterling, call your first witness." The prosecution calls Dr. Henry Morrison. Dr. Morrison took the stand, looking older than his years, his hands steady despite the weight of what he was about to say. Sterling led him through the testimony with surgical precision. The condition Ruth was in when Graham brought her. The malnutrition, the dehydration, the infected wounds. Doctor, in your 30 years of practice, have you ever seen worse injuries on a child outside of wartime? No, sir, I have not. And in your professional opinion, could these injuries have been accidental? Morrison's jaw tightened. Absolutely not. The pattern of scarring is consistent with repeated whippings. The burn marks on her hands are from cigarettes. The broken ribs that healed incorrectly suggest she was beaten while already injured and left without medical care. This was systematic torture. The jury, 12 men ranging from young to old, all white, all wearing expressions that were hard to read, shifted in their seats. Graham tried to gauge their reactions and saw nothing conclusive. Some looked disturbed, others skeptical. One man in the back row, heavy-set and scowling, looked openly hostile. Ambrose Morrison's cross-examination was brief and pointed. Doctor, you examined this child once correct. You have no direct knowledge of how she obtained these injuries. I know the pattern. I know what abuse looks like. But you cannot say with certainty that my client inflicted them. Children are clumsy. They fall. They injure themselves. Not like this. But you cannot say with absolute certainty. Morrison's silence was damning. The jury noted it. Sterling called witness after witness. Margaret Whitmore testified about her husband's investigation, about his suspicions, about his convenient death. Pastor Williams, Hannah shaking, testified about his own complicity, his own silence, the donations he had accepted while children suffered. I thought legal meant moral, Williams said, his voice breaking. I was wrong. I should have spoken up years ago. But you didn't, Morrison said on cross-examination. You took Mr. Cobb's money and asked no questions. And now, conveniently, you have found your conscience. Williams had no answer. Then Daniel Reeves took the stand. He walked slowly, still recovering from old injuries and new guilt. When he sat down, his eyes went immediately to Ruth, who sat in the front row between Graham and Beatrice. Her small hand clutched in Beatrice's large one. Mr. Reeves, Sterling began, what was your relationship with Jedediah Cobb? I worked for him 4 years. I was his enforcer. I supervised children administered punishments, buried bodies. The courtroom erupted. Harrison banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. When silence finally fell, Sterling continued. Did you personally harm Ruth Morrison? Yes. Daniel's voice was steady, though tears ran down his face. I held her down while Cobb beat her. Twice. Once for working too slowly. Once for stealing bread to eat. Why are you testifying today? Because I can't live with what I've done. Because 14 children are dead and I did nothing. Because that little girl deserves justice and I deserve whatever punishment comes from telling the truth. Sterling walked to the prosecution table, picked up the ledger they had stolen from Cobb's house. Your Honor, I submit this as evidence. It's Mr. Cobb's personal record. Every punishment, every child, every death, all documented in his own handwriting. Morrison objected. That ledger was obtained illegally. It should be excluded. It was obtained by concerned citizens during what they believed to be a welfare check, Sterling countered. And regardless of how it was obtained, it proves systematic abuse and murder. Harrison looked trapped. The entire courtroom was watching him, waiting to see if he would exclude the evidence that proved his own corruption. I'll allow it, he said finally, his voice tight, but I'm noting the irregular circumstances of its acquisition. Sterling opened the ledger, began reading entries. Each one was a horror. Ruth Morrison, 15 lashes. Samuel Johnson, punishment shed, deceased. Elijah Brown, severe beating, internal injuries, deceased. Mary Williams, infection from untreated wounds, deceased. The list went on and on. By the time Sterling finished, several members of the jury looked ill. Daniel continued his testimony, describing the burial ground, naming every child he could remember, detailing the system that allowed Cobb to work children to death with legal impunity. Morrison's cross-examination was vicious. Mr. Reeves, you claim to be testifying out of conscience. But isn't it true you were offered immunity from prosecution? I was offered it. I refused. Morrison paused, clearly not expecting that answer. You refused immunity. Yes, sir. If I'm going to tell the truth, I should face the consequences. I expect to be charged with accessory to murder after this trial. Then why testify? Daniel looked at Ruth again. Because she survived hell, and I helped and put her there. The least I can do is help keep her from going back. The emotional weight of his testimony hung in the air like smoke. Even Morrison seemed momentarily at a loss for words. The lunch recess came and went. Graham couldn't eat, his stomach too knotted with tension. Ruth picked at her food, her face pale and drawn. "You're doing great," Beatrice told her. "Just a little longer." "I have to testify next, don't I?" "Yes, but we'll be right there. You won't be alone." When court reconvened, Sterling called Ruth Morrison to the stand. She walked forward on legs that shook her small frame, nearly swallowed by the witness chair. The bailiff had to get a box for her feet to reach the ground. She looked impossibly young, impossibly vulnerable. Sterling's questioning was gentle, leading Ruth through her story step by step. How Cobb had found her after her mother died. How she had been put to work in his logging operation at age 6. The beatings, the starvation, the terror. "Ruth, can you tell the court about Samuel Johnson?" Ruth's voice was barely audible. "He was my friend. He was 10. He tried to run away." "What happened to him?" "Mr. Cobb's men caught him. Mr. Cobb beat him until he couldn't walk. Then he locked Samuel in the punishment shed. It was January. There was no heat, no blanket. We heard Samuel screaming all night, begging to be let out." Ruth's voice cracked. "In the morning it was quiet. Mr. Cobb opened the door. Samuel was dead, frozen. His eyes were still open." Several jurors were openly wiping their eyes now. Even the hostile man in the back looked uncomfortable. "What did Mr. Cobb do with Samuel's body?" "Buried him in the field, made us watch, said that's what happens to runners." "How old were you when this happened?" 6. I was 6 years old." Sterling let that sit for a moment, let the jury absorb the image of a 6-year-old child being forced to watch her friend's frozen corpse. Then Morrison began his cross-examination, and everything changed. He approached Ruth like a hunter, approaching prey, his smile pleasant, his voice smooth. "Ruth, that's a very dramatic story. Did anyone help you practice it?" "No, sir." "Really, Mrs. Wade didn't coach you, tell you what to say?" "She helped me remember, but she didn't tell me what to say." "I see. And isn't it true that you want to stay with Mr. and Mrs. Wade, that you don't want to go back to Mr. Cobb's camp?" "Yes, sir." "So you have a very good reason to lie, don't you? To make Mr. Cobb look bad so the judge will let you stay where you want to be." Ruth's hands clenched in her lap. "I'm not lying." "Of course you'd say that, but let's talk about your mother. Isn't it true she was a prostitute?" Sterling shot to his feet, sawed. "Objection. Relevance. I'm establishing the witness's background, Your Honor." "Overruled. The witness will answer." Ruth's face had gone white. "My mama was not a prostitute. She was a laundress. She worked herself to death keeping me fed. And after she died, you lived on the streets, stealing, lying, doing whatever it took to survive. Isn't that right?" "I survived, that's all." Morrison moved closer, his voice dropping to something almost kind, which somehow made it worse. "Ruth, I'm going to ask you a direct question. Did you make up these stories about Mr. Cobb because you want to stay with the Wades?" "No." "Did Mrs. knows Wade tell you that if you testified against Mr. Cobb, you could stay with them forever?" "She told me to tell the truth." "But the truth is convenient, isn't it? The truth just happens to be exactly what you need it to be to get what you want." Ruth stood up in the witness chair, her small body shaking with rage and grief and something that looked like desperation. "Don't you call me a liar," her voice cracked across the courtroom like thunder. "My mama died protecting me from men like him. She was good and kind, and she loved me. And Mr. Cobb is a monster who kills children. I watched Samuel die. I watched Elijah cough up blood until he stopped breathing. I watched Mary get infection in her wounds because Mr. Cobb wouldn't pay for medicine." Tears were streaming down her face now, but her voice was strong. "You want to know why I'm testifying? Because the dead children can't. Because someone has to tell the truth about what happens in that place. And if you don't believe me, then you're just as bad as he is." The courtroom was dead silent. Ruth was crying now, great heaving sobs that shook her whole body. Graham started to stand, but Beatrice put a hand on his arm, holding him back. "Let her finish," Beatrice whispered. Ruth looked directly at the jury, her face wet with tears, her voice raw but clear. "I know you think I'm lying, because I'm a Negro girl and he's a white man with money. But I'm not lying, and you know I'm not, because if I was making this up, I'd make up something easier, something that didn't hurt so much to remember. I wouldn't put myself through this if it wasn't real. I'd just go back, stay quiet, and probably die there like Samuel and Elijah and Mary and all the others. But I'm here. I'm fighting because Mama B told me I deserve to live, and Papa Graham promised he'd protect me, and I believe them. She sat back down, her small body still shaking. Morrison looked at Harrison, clearly wanting to continue his attack, but the judge was watching Ruth with an expression that was hard to read. "Mr. Morrison," Harrison said quietly, "do you have further questions for this witness?" Morrison looked at the jury. Several of them were openly crying. Even the hostile man in the back had his jaw clenched, his hands fisted on his knees. "No, Your Honor," Morrison said. "No further questions." Ruth was excused. She walked back to her seat on legs that barely held her, and Beatrice pulled her close, holding her while she cried. Sterling called one more witness, Beatrice Wade. She took the stand with a dignity that Graham had come to recognize, her size somehow making her more imposing rather than less. Sterling led her through her testimony, finding Ruth at the fair, watching her nearly die. The decision to help. "Mrs. Wade, you've only known Ruth for a few weeks. Why are you willing to risk so much for her?" Beatrice was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "Because I know what it's like to be seen as less than human. My entire life, people have judged me based on my size. They've called me lazy, disgusting, worthless. I had money, education, and white skin to protect me, and it still hurt. It still made me feel small inside, even as my body grew large." She looked at Ruth. That child had nothing. No money, no protection, not even the comfort of knowing people would see her as human. She was property to Cobb. Less than property. And when I saw her dying while people watched, I saw every moment I've been invisible. Every time I've been dismissed or or treated like I don't matter. And I decided not this time. Not to this child. What do you hope happens here today? I hope the jury chooses humanity over legality. I hope they look at that brave little girl and see someone worth protecting. And I hope they look at Jedediah Cobb and see him for what he is, a monster in a nice suit. Morrison's cross-examination was predictably cruel. "Mrs. Wade, you're a mail-order bride, correct? You came to Wyoming because you couldn't find a husband in Boston. I came because I needed work and Mr. Wade needed help. You've been married to Mr. Wade for less than a week. Before that, you were essentially his employee. Isn't this adoption just a way to secure your position, to make yourself indispensable?" Beatrice's eyes went hard. "I married Graham because I love him. I want to adopt Ruth because I love her. If you can't understand that love isn't transactional, I pity you. You're obese, Mrs. Wade. You can barely fit in the witness chair. How can you properly care for children when you can't even care for yourself?" The courtroom gasped. Several people started to object, but Beatrice held up her hand. "I wake at 4:30 every morning. I cook, clean, manage a ranch, care for 3 children. I can lift loads most men struggle with. I can work from dawn to dusk without complaining. I infiltrated Cobb's camp and retrieved the evidence that's convicting him." Her voice was steel. "What exactly am I unfit for, Mr. Morrison? What physical task can I not perform, or are you just uncomfortable with the idea that a woman who looks like me might be more capable than you?" Morrison's face went red. "I'm simply questioning whether you're simply attempting to shame me for my appearance. It won't work. I spent too many years being ashamed. I'm done with that, and I'm certainly not going to be shamed by a man who defends child murderers for money." Harrison banged his gavel. "Mrs. Wade, please. I apologize, Your Honor, but I won't apologize for speaking truth. That man tortured children. You signed papers that let him do it, and everyone in this room knows it." Beatrice's voice carried across the courtroom. "The only question is whether we're going to keep pretending it's acceptable because it's legal, or whether we're going to choose what's right." The testimony concluded. Sterling and Morrison gave their closing arguments, though Graham barely heard them. His mind was stuck on Ruth's face as she testified on Beatrice's words, on the weight of what they were all asking 12 strangers to do. Then the jury was dismissed to deliberate, and there was nothing left but waiting. 6 hours. 6 hours that felt like 6 years. Graham paced outside the courtroom, unable to sit still, unable to think about anything except what would happen if they lost. Beatrice sat with Ruth, humming quietly, her presence an anchor in the storm. Emmy and Toby had been sent to wait with Margaret, spared the agony of watching this final act. But Ruth insisted on staying, her small hand clutched in Beatrice's large one, her face set with determination. Finally, the bailiff emerged. Jury's back. They filed into the courtroom, taking their seats. Graham tried to read their faces and saw nothing. The foreman was an older man, a farmer with weathered hands and kind eyes. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Harrison asked. His voice was tight, controlled. "We have your honor." "On the charge of child abuse, how do you find—" The foreman stood. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. "Guilty." The word was like a thunderclap. The courtroom erupted in shouts, some of joy, some of outrage. Harrison banged his gavel repeatedly. "On the charge of manslaughter, 14 counts, how do you find—" "Guilty." "On the charge of fraud—" "Guilty." Cobb stood, his face purple with rage. "This is a travesty. I have rights. I have—" "You have the right to remain silent," Harrison said, his voice cold, "and I suggest you exercise it." Two marshals moved forward, placing Cobb in handcuffs. He struggled, shouting threats, promising revenge. But his voice was drowned out by the sound of the courtroom, half celebrating, half protesting, everyone talking at once. Graham pulled Ruth into his arms, holding her tight while she sobbed. Beatrice wrapped her arms around both of them, her body shaking with relief and joy and exhaustion. Sterling appeared beside them, his face split with a grin. "We won. By God, we actually won." But the celebration was short-lived. Morrison stood, his face grim. "Your Honor, I move for immediate sentencing." Harrison looked at Morrison for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he shook his head. "I'm recusing myself from sentencing. Given my previous involvement with the guardianship documents, I believe there's a conflict of interest. Magistrate Thomas Reynolds from Denver will handle sentencing in 2 weeks." The admission was stunning. Harrison was essentially admitting his own corruption, stepping aside before anyone could force him. It wasn't justice, but it was something. The courtroom cleared slowly. Cobb was led away in chains, still shouting threats. Graham saw him look back once, his eyes finding Ruth, and the hatred there was so pure it made Graham's blood run cold. As the crowd thinned, two federal marshals approached Judge Harrison at the bench. The judge's face went ashen. "William Harrison," one marshal said, loud enough for those remaining to hear. "You're under arrest for bribery, corruption, and conspiracy to defraud the territory of Wyoming." Harrison stood slowly, his hands shaking. "There must be some mistake." "No mistake, Your Honor. We have the letters. We have the payment records. All of it." The marshal produced handcuffs. "You have the right to remain silent." Graham watched as Harrison was led away. The man's shoulders slumped in defeat. It wasn't just Cobb who would pay. The entire corrupt system was coming down. Sterling appeared at Graham's elbow. "That's the final piece. With Harrison facing charges, every guardianship he signed is now under review. Cobb's entire operation is finished." "He meant what he said," Graham told Sterling quietly. "About revenge, even from prison, he'll find a way." "Then we make sure he never gets out," Sterling said. "And we pray Reynolds is a better man than Harrison." 2 weeks later, they returned to Boulder for sentencing. The courtroom was even more packed this time, word having spread across the territory about the trial, the verdict, the child who had stood up to power and won. Magistrate Thomas Reynolds was everything Harrison wasn't. Younger, sharper, with eyes that missed nothing, and a reputation for fairness that was almost legendary. He reviewed the case files for an hour before calling court to order. "Jedediah Cobb," Reynolds said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "you have been found guilty of heinous crimes. The evidence shows systematic torture and murder of children entrusted to your care. You exploited legal guardianship to create what was essentially a slave labor camp. You corrupted public officials to enable your crimes. And when finally brought to justice, you showed no remorse, no recognition of the harm you caused." Cobb stood silent, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. "I sentence you to hang by the neck until dead, sentenced to be carried out in 30 days. The courtroom erupted again. Cobb lunged forward, breaking free from the marshals for just a moment. His hand went to his jacket, emerged with a small pistol that nobody had found in their searches. He aimed it at Ruth. Everything happened at once. Graham threw himself forward, knocking Ruth to the ground. Beatrice moved with surprising speed, her bulk shielding both of them. A marshal fired. Cobb's shot went wide, splintering the wall behind where Ruth had been standing. Cobb felt blood blooming on his shoulder, the gun clattering from his hand. He was screaming incoherent with rage and pain, promising death to everyone, everything. "Lock him away," Reynolds said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "And search him properly this time." In the aftermath, as order was slowly restored, Reynolds called Graham and Beatrice forward. "Mr. and Mrs. Wade, given the circumstances and the corruption involved in the original guardianship, I'm nullifying all of Mr. Cobb's legal claims to Ruth Morrison. If you wish to adopt her, you may file the appropriate paperwork." 3 weeks later, they stood in Reynolds' chambers for the adoption hearing. Ruth wore her blue dress freshly washed and pressed. Her hair was braided with ribbons Emmy had saved for special occasions. "Ruth," Reynolds said gently, "do you understand what adoption means?" "Yes, sir. It means they choose me. Forever." "And is this what you want? More than anything? What name do you want?" Ruth looked at Graham, at Beatrice, at the family she had found against all odds. "Ruth Catherine Wade. Ruth after my mama. Catherine after Papa Graham's first wife. Wade because they were my family." Reynolds signed the papers with a flourish. "Ruth Catherine Wade, welcome to your family, officially and forever." Ruth ran to Graham and Beatrice, throwing her arms around them both. They held her close, this child they had chosen, who had chosen them, while Reynolds smiled and Emmy and Toby cheered, and the world rearranged itself around this new truth. The celebration at the ranch that evening drew half the territory. People came bearing food gifts, congratulations. The children who had been rescued from Cobb's camp came too, 14 of them, all placed with families who wanted them, all beginning the long process of healing. Daniel Reeves appeared briefly, just long enough to say goodbye. He had served 60 days in jail for his crimes, a sentence that felt inadequate, but was all the law allowed for a man who had cooperated so fully. "I'm leaving for Denver," he told Graham, "going to work with an orphan outreach program. Try to make sure what happened at Cobb's never happens again." Ruth approached him, her small face serious. "Mr. Daniel." "Yes. I don't forgive you yet. Maybe I never will, but—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Thank you for trying to be better. Mama B says everyone deserves a chance to choose who they become. I hope you choose good." Daniel's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Ruth. That's more than I deserve." He left as the sun was setting, a man carrying the weight of his sins, but finally walking towards something like redemption. The party continued into the night. Laughter and music, and the kind of joy that only comes after surviving something that should have destroyed you. Graham stood on his porch watching his family, his friends, his community, and felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Peace. Real peace. Beatrice joined him, her hand finding his. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking about promises, about the ones I've kept and the ones I almost broke." Graham looked at Ruth dancing with Emmy and Toby in the firelight. "I promised Catherine I'd raise our children right. I thought that was the last promise I'd ever make. But then I promised Ruth I'd protect her. And I promised you I'd be a real husband, not just a transaction. And you kept them all," Beatrice said softly. "We kept them all. Together." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one across the vast Wyoming sky. 5 years passed like water through open fingers. The ranch prospered, expanding with the addition of new land and new livestock. Graham's reputation grew, the man who had stood up to Cobb becoming something of a legend, though he never encouraged the stories. Beatrice had lost some weight from the physical labor, maybe 60 pounds, but she was still a large woman, still occasionally faced whispers and stares. The difference was she no longer cared. She had found her place, her purpose, her family. Emmy grew into a young woman of 15, beautiful and fierce, in teaching at the local school. Toby at 11 was chatty and confident, the silent ghost of his early years completely gone. And Ruth, 13 now, was healthy and bright and passionate about justice in a way that reminded Graham of Catherine. Beatrice and Graham had twins 3 years after the adoption, a boy and a girl they named Matthew and Grace. The ranch was loud and chaotic and full of life. 5 years had passed since that summer of 1885. Graham was 45 now, the lines around his eyes deeper, but softened by contentment. One August evening, as the sun painted the mountains gold, he sat on his porch with Toby, who had asked about the summer they had brought Ruth home. "Papa," Toby said, "why did you marry Mama B? People still talk about it sometimes. About how she was a mail-order bride about her size." Graham thought about how to answer, how to explain the inexplicable. "Son, let me tell you about the summer I learned what real strength looks like." And he told the story, all of it. Finding Ruth at the fair, Beatrice's courage, the trial, the victory, the family they had built from broken pieces. When he finished, the sun had set and stars were emerging overhead. Toby was quiet for a long moment. "So you married her because she was brave?" "I married her because she showed me that the strongest people aren't the ones who never fall. They're the ones who fall and choose to stand back up. Your mother, my first wife, taught me how to love. Mama B taught me how to fight for that love. Both lessons were necessary." They sat together in comfortable silence. Then Ruth appeared, 13 years old and beautiful, her smile still rare but genuine when it came. "Papa," she said, "do you ever think about that day at the fair?" "Every day." "What would have happened if you'd walked away?" Graham considered the question seriously. "I would have survived, but I wouldn't have lived. There's a difference." Ruth sat down beside him, Toby on his other side. Inside the house, he could hear Beatrice singing to the twins, her voice still surprisingly lovely. Emmy was reading aloud to someone, probably Matthew, who loves stories. "I'm writing something," Ruth said suddenly, "for school, about what happened, about Cobb and the trial and—" She paused. "About family, what it really means." "What does it mean?" Graham asked. "It means people who choose each other, who fight for each other, who show up day after day, year after years, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." Ruth looked up at him, her eyes bright in the starlight. "It means you and Mama B. It means this." Graham felt his throat tighten. "You should write that. People need to hear it." "I will. I'm going to be a teacher like Emmy, and a writer, and an activist. I'm going to make sure what happened to Samuel and Elijah and Mary never happens to anyone else." "That's a big goal." "You taught me to aim big. You and Mama B both." Beatrice emerged from the house, the twins toddling beside her. Matthew went straight to Graham, climbing into his lap without asking permission. Grace attached herself to Ruth, who scooped her up with practiced ease. "Family meeting on the porch," Beatrice asked, settling her bulk onto the steps with a groan of satisfaction. "Telling stories," Graham said. "The good kind, the true kind." Emmy appeared, joining them, the whole family gathered in the cooling evening air. For a moment, Graham just looked at them. His daughter by blood and his daughter by choice. His son who had finally found his voice. His wife who had come as a stranger and stayed as his anchor. His babies who knew nothing but love and safety. "You know what I realized," Ruth said suddenly. "Mama Catherine is part of this family too, even though she's gone, because she's in Emmy and Toby. And the lessons she taught you, Papa, they're lessons you taught me, so in a way I have two mothers. One I never met and one I never expected." Beatrice's eyes filled with tears. She pulled Ruth close, kissing the top of her head. "You have the best parts of both of us," Beatrice said. "Catherine's kindness and my stubbornness. You're going to change the world, sweetheart." "We all are," Ruth said firmly. "Together." As darkness fell and the stars multiplied overhead, Graham thought about the journey that had brought them here. The desperation that had made him send that letter. The courage that had made Beatrice answer it. The moment at the fair when he had chosen to act instead of walking away. "What are you thinking?" Beatrice asked the question she always asked. "I'm thinking about legacy, about what we leave behind." Graham shifted Matthew to his other knee. "People ask what I want to be remembered for. I don't need monuments or statues. I have this, a family built not on blood, but on choice, on promises kept, on love that showed up every day and did the work." "That's not a small thing," Beatrice said. "No, it's everything." They sat together as the night deepened, the children eventually heading inside to bed, leaving just Graham and Beatrice on the porch. The ranch stretched out before them, peaceful and prosperous, a testament to what could be built when people chose love over fear. "Do you ever regret it?" Graham asked. "Coming here, everything that happened." Beatrice laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "Regret finding a family. Regret discovering I was stronger than I knew. Regret helping save a child's life and destroying a monster in the process. She took his hand. Graham Wade, marrying you and adopting Ruth are the best decisions I ever made. I came here expecting a transaction and found a home. How could I regret that? Some people still talk, still judge. Let them. Their opinions stopped mattering the moment I realized I had everything I needed right here. Graham pulled her close, this woman who had arrived as a desperate stranger and become the foundation on which his new life was built. They sat in silence watching the stars, thinking about the past and the future and the present moment that held them both. Inside the house, Ruth was writing in her journal by lamplight, the words flowing faster than she could catch them. She wrote about Samuel in the cold shed, about Cobb's smile and the fear it brought, about Graham's promise and Beatrice's protection, about the trial and the victory and the family that had saved her. She wrote until her hand cramped, until the words ran dry, until she had captured every memory she could bear to hold. Then she closed the journal, blew out the lamp, and lay in the bed that was hers, in the house that was hers, with the family that had chosen her. Outside her window, the Wyoming sky stretched infinite and clear, full of stars and possibilities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fights, new moments when she would have to choose between silence and truth. But tonight she was safe. She was loved. She was home. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. Years later, when Ruth Catherine Wade was 87 years old and dying peacefully in a hospital bed, surrounded by her 5 children, 14 grandchildren, and 23 great-grandchildren, a reporter would ask her what she remembered most about her childhood. She would think about Cobb and the camp and the horrors she had survived, but that's not what she would talk about. Instead, she would tell the story of a cowboy who kept his promises and a mail-order bride who taught her what strength really meant. She would talk about a family built on choice and courage and the stubborn refusal to let cruelty have the last word. They saved me, she would say, her voice still strong despite her failing body. But more than that, they showed me I was worth saving, and that changed everything. The reporter would write it all down, would publish the story, and people across the country would read about Graham and Beatrice Wade, about the summer of 1885, about the trial that changed Wyoming territory. But Ruth's children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would know the real story, the one about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, about promises kept in the face of impossible odds, about love that showed up day after day, year after year, generation after generation. That story would be told and retold, changing slightly with each telling, but always holding the same truth at its core. Family isn't about blood. It's about choice. It's about showing up. It's about keeping promises even when keeping them costs everything. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it's about a cowboy, a mail-order bride, and a little girl who needed saving, all finding each other in the exact moment they needed to be found. That's not just a story. That's a legacy. And it lives on long after the stars have shifted, long after the ranch has been sold, long after everyone who lived it has turned to dust. Because some things, the best things, the most important things, they never really die. They just keep growing, spreading, touching new lives, creating new families, inspiring new promises. Years later, when Graham Wade was 72 and Beatrice was 73, they would sit on that same porch and watch Ruth ride off to her first teaching position in Denver. Graham would take Beatrice's hand, weathered now, but still strong, and say, "We did good." And Beatrice would smile that same smile she'd given him the day she arrived with her battered suitcase and impossible courage. We did more than good. We changed the world, one little girl at a time. Graham would pull her close, this woman who came as a stranger and became his everything. I love you, Beatrice Hartwell Wade. And I love you, Graham. Always have, always will. They would sit there until the stars came out, holding hands, 2 people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built something that would outlast them both. That's not just a happy ending. That's a promise kept. Ruth would go on to teach for 40 years, marry a kind man named Thomas, raise 5 beautiful children, and inspire thousands of students across 3 states. But she would always say that everything good in her life started on that dusty fairground in Willow Creek when a cowboy chose kindness over fear. Forever.